Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask just one question tied to current events. The goal is to leave you with the tools that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. When it comes to inclusive workplace design, we often have two choices. We can either modify existing policies and practices, or we can create new ones. Many factors can decide which path we choose. Most often, though, time and budget constrains these decisions. But what's being lost, or maybe what's being gained, if we choose creation over modification, or vice versa? And what is the difference between the two? So, for today's question, I'm asking, what is the difference between creation versus modification when we think about DEI and the workplace? And to answer this question, I'm excited to be joined by Layla Zia. Layla, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Melissa. It's very exciting for me.
So I'm excited to dig into this topic, but before we do, I just want to tell you a little bit more about Layla. Currently working at the intersection of education and development and DEI, Layla's focus is on how to bring inclusion practices into life. They have a master's in management and worked as a DEI curriculum developer in Toronto, Canada. They have been working with kids and adults in different capacities, which give them a holistic worldview to critically assess the status quo and plan for change. Layla believes the root of all DEI practices is access, and organizations need to have a creation approach to accessibility rather than modification for it to work in the long term. So Layla, as I mentioned, it's a pleasure to have you. So maybe we can start with how you came up with the idea of creation versus modification.
Yeah, I think the idea came to me a long ago when I was a teacher back in my own country, but I didn't really have the terminologies, the words for it. I was not even very familiar with the DEI concept and terminology, but I was always seeking for different ways to make a better engagement with my students, to make the classroom more accessible for my students. And I've seen students thrive more when something as small as desks format and shape in the classroom change to circular. In a circular format, students have better access to the board, to the teacher, and each other. Like communication happens not only through words, but eyes and body language. Circular format is not modifying the classroom shape, it is creating a new shape in that environment. For example, if we wanted to modify the format of the classroom, it would be changing students' seats in the previous shape and format based on their height, based on who is speaking to whom, or like bringing the kids with lower attention span to the front seats. Modification was basically asking students, or for today's concepts in organizational view, asking employees to do different, whereas creation is to give them a new and more accessible playing ground, which leads to a different behavior, leads to a different interaction.
I think that's really cool that you've drawn inspiration for this from the classroom. How does this look like in organizations, though?
So in organizations, let me give you an example. For example, a good example in organizations can be hiring policies. Right now, to avoid biased decisions, companies decided to, for example, scrap the name out of the resumes when staff is assessing the resumes, or leave the initial assessment to the AI. Today, we know that although it might be impactful in some ways, it might be successful in some ways, it is still very biased. The AI that us humans are creating is biased. So this whole thing is modifying the existing process, because although you're bringing like a technology aspect to it, but still you are creating that technology. Whereas if you want in creation, there is an intentionality, intention to decide to hire from a specific social group to balance out the diversity. It is to put more than one person in the hiring committee in a way that the committee is diverse enough to see candidates from different perspectives. It is to give access more to the social group, to different social groups, to the job postings in the first place. So in creation, there is an intentionality, but in modification, there is only a hope that so and so would work. At the same time, creation at the first glance is very expensive. Expensive in terms of human resources, expensive in terms of time, expensive in terms of all the resources that we need to put together. But I believe that is a longer term investment, whereas where we modify, we get immediate results, but what happens is not after long later, we need to do all the things over again. So the cost will actually be the same, but in a longer process.
So when you're working with organizations, and I don't know, we sometimes find this too, is that it can be hard to sort of map out that investment, right? That longer term investment. And so I really like this concept, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show, because I thought you had a really interesting approach, and I really liked the simplification or the distilling to modification versus creation, right? Because we can continue to modify, or we can start to create the world and the organizations that we actually want. And one sort of the modification hits that pain point, it solves, it relieves that pain, but often, because we were just sort of addressing one issue, we haven't thought about all the larger stuff. And so creation takes,
exactly,
from what I understand, from what our conversations, is that this is taking a holistic view to create something that's going to work for everyone. So when you're working or when you're talking to organizations, how do you frame this? How do you sort of, I won't say sell people on it, but essentially sort of, help people to understand that this longer term, this holistic, this creationist approach is actually going to lead to better outcomes than sort of the piecemeal modification?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I usually tell clients is exactly this. I come up front to say that, okay, this is not an immediate solution. You need patience. You need patience with the solution, because if we want to work strategically, when you are like budgeting out a new product, when you want to decide between two products, you look into the future of each product. Which one serves you more? Which one can be a solution for a longer term? Which one can sustain more? It is the same when you're looking at human problems. We need to look at what leads to a sustainable change, because if it's not a sustainable change, the company, the organization is always shaking, because those people are who makes the organization work. I saw lots of quittings happening during this pandemic, not only because the pandemic itself, because companies didn't know how to, rightfully, we didn't know how to do everything virtually, because we needed to create new processes, whereas we were trying to only modify the old, whatever that we had. We tried to put, for example, a happy hour where everyone hated the happy hour in virtual settings. We did not know how to create a virtual happy hour. We just wanted to bring the in-person happy hour to the virtual setting. So what retains people in their job is the longer term investment. Also, in creation, what happens is that you're not only educating people about different things, you're also giving them a new structure. So what happens is new structure and new human practices, new communication practices, new behavioral practices goes along together. So what happens then is that you have a structure and you have people who behave in a more, for example, inclusive ways. Then let's say even that person leaves the company after 2 years. You still have the structure, and this person will go to any other company with that knowledge, with that behavior. So with creating new structures where everyone has a chance to speak up, the playing ground basically is more accessible. So they practice until the practice, the attitudes, they practice the inclusive behaviors until it becomes a habit. And when something becomes a behavior, it travels everyone with that person to a new organization, new community, new neighborhood, new city. So if we invest in a longer term process, we're not only investing in sustaining our company's culture, I believe that we're investing in our society's culture, in our city, which I think in our neighborhoods. And I think this is what is very much needed these days.
That's really interesting. Actually, we just kicked off season 3. And so the first episode that we talked about was wellness. And we talked about personal wellness, organizational wellness, and actually community wellness. And so by investing in personal wellness, we can also invest in organizational wellness. And when organizations are well, when the people within organizations are well, we end up having communities who are well. And I thought that was a really neat, moving beyond sort of the, obviously, at the individual level, it's very important. At the organizational level, it's very important. But as a society, as we are more inclusive, as we are more equitable, like these, I love that, the idea that these behaviors travel, which is a really cool idea. Great teams fuel great business. In the office, on the road, in the field, and around the world, your people are working together to make it happen, to make something new, to do something better, to delight customers again and again. At Dialectic, we believe that even the best teams can get better. Dialectic is a learning company obsessed with helping teams reach their potential. Using person-centered, empathetic design and social science research methods, we build digital and in-person training that helps your people build habits that unlock enthusiastic collaboration and true belonging. For example, Learning Snippets is a diversity, equity, and inclusion microlearning program that helps your people build inclusive habits in 3 minutes or less. Your team can practice living your organization's values with off-the-shelf programs like inclusive leadership, gender identity, or offsetting racial bias. Or let Dialectic design a solution tailored to your needs, from digital transformation and difficult conversations to disaster preparedness or design thinking. Learn more about how Dialectic could help unlock your team's potential at dialectic.solutions. And if you want to see how Learning Snippets puts DEI concepts into action, you'll find the link in the show notes. And now, back to the show. If we're thinking about how we can create, I love this, create, very intentional with this word here, more inclusive workplaces, what does that look like?
I wish I could have an exact answer, but if I give you like sort of a universal answer, will be exactly opposite of whatever idea that I just put over there. Inclusion and accessibility are collective concepts. They are meaningful in teams, but as we just talked about it, they start with individuals. Racism, sexism, ageism, all the isms that we're suffering from shows differently in every country, in every city, every neighborhood, every team. So, and individuals have different access needs to feel belonged, to feel included and seen. So my answer is to start with understanding the community you're working in. And remember that there are millions of ways to create an inclusive workplace. And remember that none of the solutions are universal. None of them are for eternity. We need to be open to feedback. We need to be dynamic because the world that we're living in is dynamic. And we need to start from investing in individuals and structures to be able to move.
I think that's really interesting. Do you have any examples of any sort of creationist projects that you've sort of worked on, or that because I think sometimes having like that tangible example is really interesting for folks.
Definitely, yes. So for example, I think what we have with all the tracking systems that we have right now, that we can track each other's work and everything, these systems give us lots of wiggle room. someone might be, for example, in my previous work, we were a small team, and each of us, well, obviously had different access needs, especially that we had people with mental illness, we had people with chronic illnesses, we had people who were newcomers, new immigrants, such as myself. So English was not the first language. So all of what we realized, for example, in the communications, is that there are two people that are usually dominating the meetings. So what we created was before each company-wide meeting that we need to bring in the ideas, we need to brainstorm, we need to do so and so, we would create a board with Miro. So, for example, before each meeting, we would go to Miro, we would list our thoughts over there. And so when we gather together, we knew that, okay, everyone has, for example, 3 post-its over there who wants to go around and talk about it. Then we restricted the questions. Okay, you're not allowed to question any of the ideas till everyone is done. And so in that sense, the ones who had, for example, me, who my English was not my first language, I could have time to process and find the right words to put in the post-its to be able to talk about it. I will also have time before that to look at other people's ideas to see if there are any concepts unfamiliar for me. So that's created, and with people who had, for example, anxiety, it gave them a structure. It gave them a structure that, okay, this is what we're talking about. Everyone has these ideas, and this is also yours, and it's valid, and everyone is going to talk about it. So this workspace, this Miro board, gave us an accessible company-wide meetings more than Zoom videos, more than we have our videos on. It gave us better engagement in our meetings, and everyone needs to turn on their videos. When, for example, a kid is running over there and there's a pile of laundry back there, and I'm just waking up from a crazy night that I had. And so we just need to see what works, what works for the people that we're working with.
To play the opposite side of the coin here. So if we're thinking about, okay, so everyone gets, or if we're thinking about how do we make something accessible for everyone, is that going to be chaotic?
This is actually a question that I had first that I was learning about accessibility. And there are people, a great friend of mine, actually, a great colleague, also asked me this. But I think not. And I've seen that it doesn't. It gets chaotic when we try to accommodate and modify the existing policy to people's needs. Whereas if we look into it as a fresh problem, it'll be accessible, not chaotic. Thinking out of the box here would be think beyond existing policies and be open to feedback. We want so bad for our organizations to work. We want so bad for structures to work that we are afraid of trying new things. We are afraid of bringing a little bit individuality in our structures and in our policies. But if we can confront that fear, and if we're willing to tip our toes in that fear in creation, I think that actually avoids chaos and bring in actually a more collaborative environment.
I think that's an amazing way to kind of close off the show is that, and then it's often an argument, right? If we're creating something that's going to work for everyone, is that just going to be wild? But really, it's actually the example that you provided us is that there was a problem with meetings, and folks had many different challenges in the way the meetings were being run. But thinking about it from a fresh perspective, how can we make these meetings work more effectively, more efficiently? And by using the board, you're solving a lot of people's problems versus like trying to accommodate each individual person, which then may mean that, yeah, that could dissolve into chaos that way. But
Exactly.
instead, you started with a fresh problem and created something totally new and a new way of working that worked for your organization at that specific time. Layla, I want to give you an opportunity to just sort of give listeners one key thing that they might take away today after our conversation.
I would love to ask them to be patient and to start from themselves. I think we often wait for our leaders to do something, but sometimes that leader may not be even familiar with inclusive practices. I think DEI will work when it is embedded within every department, every team, every process. And equity practices, access practices, inclusive practices are not that hard. And right now, there are tons of resources out there, like this podcast, that we can learn from them. There are tons of resources in different formats, in audio formats, in video formats, in text formats, story formats, Instagram posts and stories. So I think we need to take them in, and we need to be patient, and we need to start from ourselves.
That's amazing. And for those who are interested in learning more about you and your work, where can they go to keep up with you?
They can always email me at laylaz94@gmail.com. They can I'm always happy to connect people through LinkedIn. And I'm working right now as an individual consultant, so I'm happy to start conversation with any of the folks who might be interested.
Amazing. Thank you. And as always, if you have any of your own questions or if you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or you can email me. Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, and this is Just One Cue.